"If you play this violin, I'll marry you." The voice of Connor Prescott thundered through the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in New York, a glass of champagne in his hand and mockery carved into his smile. His words cracked against the golden walls and crystal chandeliers, igniting waves of laughter from the glittering crowd. The echoes of that cruelty bounced over polished marble floors, mingling with the sharp clicks of heels and the shallow applause of those eager to see someone fall. There, among silver trays and whispered orders, stood Zoe Williams, the invisible maid of the night. Her black uniform with its white apron trembled along with her clenched hands as dozens of eyes turned toward her, pointing as if she were a cheap spectacle. The elite, dressed in diamonds and arrogance, waited hungrily. They wanted her to falter, to run, to break under the weight of their ridicule. But no one in that hall, not even Connor himself, imagined that the game born of arrogance would twist into something none of them could control. Because before the night ended, the laughter would die, and silence would reign in a way they would never forget. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The chandeliers blazed like suns above the gilded hall, their light bouncing off mirrors and sequined gowns. The orchestra had just paused, glasses of champagne clinked, and a low hum of gossip filled the air. Then, with a theatrical flourish, Connor, the millionaire CEO known for his ruthless charm, raised a violin as if it were a toy. His smile spread wide, predatory and amused, as he turned toward the youngest of the servers, a girl in a crisp black and white uniform, balancing a tray with trembling hands. "If you play this violin," he announced, his voice echoing through the cavernous ballroom, "I'll marry you." The laughter came like thunder. Expensive shoes scraped against the marble as men leaned forward and women covered their painted lips, delighted by the cruelty dressed as entertainment. Phones rose instantly, their tiny red lights blinking, capturing every angle of the humiliation about to unfold. Zoe froze. Her fingers clenched the tray so tightly the stem of a glass cracked. Heat flushed her face as dozens of eyes turned toward her, piercing her uniform, her skin, her very breath. She wanted to disappear into the polished floor. She was a shadow in their world, a cleaning lady turned temporary server, invisible until he decided to make her the spectacle. Connor stepped closer, still grinning, offering her the violin like a poisoned gift. "What's the matter?" he teased. "Scared? Or do your talents end at serving drinks?" His words dripped with ridicule, and again the crowd erupted, feeding on her silence like vultures circling a wounded creature. Her throat tightened, but she didn't speak. Not yet. The pressure of memory pressed harder than the weight of their laughter. Somewhere behind the haze of panic, she saw the wrinkled hands of Frank, her grandfather, guiding her small fingers over strings worn from years of playing in subway tunnels. His voice whispered in her mind, steady and patient, "Don't look at the crowd. Listen to the note inside you." She set the tray down on a table, her movements mechanical, deliberate. The music had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was louder than any melody. Connor chuckled, mistaking her stillness for surrender, and tilted the violin closer until it nearly touched her chest. "Prove yourself," he murmured, the challenge now a private dagger thrust in front of hundreds. Zoe reached out, her hand hovered, shaking not from lack of skill but from the storm building inside her. She could feel every gaze stabbing at her back, every whisper crawling up her skin. Yet when her fingers finally closed around the wood, the hall seemed to shift, as if even the chandeliers held their breath. Connor leaned back, smirking, certain of her failure. Behind him, the guests exchanged eager glances, phones raised higher. They wanted a collapse, a disaster to share, but Zoe lifted the violin slowly, cradling it against her neck with a familiarity no one expected. The mocking smiles faltered just slightly as the room tilted into suspense. The weight of the violin lingered in her hand, as if the polished wood carried centuries of judgment. Zoe's fingers hovered above the strings, not pressing, not yet daring. The hall was a beast breathing around her, silken gowns shifting, cufflinks glinting, phones recording with ruthless patience. Somewhere in the corner, a woman whispered too loudly, "She'll break it before she plays a note." Laughter rippled again, cruel and eager. Connor adjusted his white bow tie and strolled in a slow circle, savoring the spectacle he had orchestrated. His voice rolled over the crowd like expensive whiskey, smooth but burning. "Come now, darling," he mocked, pausing just behind her shoulder. "This is your chance to trade an apron for a wedding dress." The chuckles came softer this time, but they still stung. His arrogance painted the air itself, suffocating her. Zoe closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a breath that seemed heavier than her own body. She wasn't in the ballroom anymore. She was back in a dim subway tunnel, the echo of trains rushing by as Frank tapped his worn shoe against the concrete, keeping rhythm. His old violin had scratches along the edge, but his smile never faltered when she drew a clean note. "Play for yourself, Zoe," he used to say. "The world will listen whether it wants to or not." Her hand tightened around the bow. The silence that followed her stillness grew uncomfortable. Guests shifted their weight, jewels glimmering as they leaned closer. Connor's grin faltered slightly, irritation flickering in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to hold out this long, to resist collapsing. His challenge had been meant as a punchline, not a pause. "Play!" a man shouted from the back, impatient. A ripple of agreement spread through the room, voices overlapping, half taunting, half curious. The hunger for drama outweighed their politeness. They wanted to see her break, and the tension only thickened the longer she stood still. Zoe lowered the violin again, not to abandon it but to check the strings, plucking one, then another. The sounds rang clear, and in that instant her posture changed. No longer shrinking, her shoulders squared, her breath steadied. Connor caught it, his eyes narrowing, unsure if he was still in control. She lifted the instrument once more, her chin resting against the wood. The crowd hushed instinctively, as if sensing the shift in energy. Connor's smirk returned quickly though, his voice sharp. "One wrong note," he whispered, low enough that only she could hear, "and you'll wish you never touched it." The bow hovered above the strings. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled, but her eyes opened now, and they were steady, focused not on him, not on the crowd, but on something deeper. The room leaned forward, suspended, waiting for either brilliance or disaster. The bow hovered like a blade above the strings, and for a moment the hall seemed to exist in two halves, those who wanted her to collapse and those who secretly craved the impossible, that she might actually play. The crystal glasses on the tables caught the candlelight, throwing fractured beams across Zoe's face, illuminating the tension in her jaw. Her pulse thundered so loudly in her ears, she almost couldn't hear the shuffle of silk gowns and leather shoes moving closer. Connor leaned lazily against a column, the violin case dangling from his fingers as though the whole moment bored him, yet his eyes betrayed an edge of sharpness, a flicker of uncertainty. This wasn't going according to his script. She was supposed to laugh nervously, refuse, and retreat to the shadows. Instead, Zoe stood frozen, the violin poised and the silence clawed at everyone's nerves. A man in a navy tuxedo muttered, "She doesn't know a single note." His wife replied with a cruel grin, "Even better. The crash will be unforgettable." Their whispers carried, feeding the cruelty in the air. Phones tilted higher, recording the anticipation, the humiliation stretched thin like glass ready to shatter. Zoe swallowed hard. The scent of champagne and roses mixed sickeningly in the air, but beneath it she smelled dust and rainwater, memories of subway tunnels where Frank's music used to echo. She saw him there, sitting on an overturned crate, his weathered hands guiding hers across the strings. "Don't play to impress, Zoe," he used to say. "Play to remember who you are." Her grip steadied. She drew the bow across one string gently, coaxing a single trembling note into the air. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't broken either. A few guests snickered, ready to erupt, but she adjusted, tightened her fingers, and plucked another string, cleaner this time. The sound echoed longer than expected, carried by the hush of the chandeliers swaying slightly above. Connor chuckled, clapping once in mock applause. "Ah, a single note. Perhaps we should fetch her a children's recorder next." His voice cut sharp through the room, and laughter followed obediently. Yet behind the ridicule, his smile stiffened, as though he'd noticed the way her shoulders squared instead of sagged. Zoe's eyes opened wide now, clear, fierce. She repositioned the bow, inhaled, and let it glide across two strings at once. The harmony bloomed richer, unexpected, a whisper of something real. The hall stiffened, laughter dimmed. Even those who had been ready to sneer found themselves holding their breath, confused. A woman near the front lowered her phone slowly, her painted lips parting in surprise. "Wait, she knows what she's doing," she whispered, almost unwilling to believe it. Connor's smirk faltered. He pushed off the column, stepping closer, his jaw tightening. His words came softer, meant only for her. "Careful, little maid. Don't think one trick note will save you." But the words lacked their earlier venom. They sounded almost defensive. Zoe didn't answer. Instead, she lifted the bow again, pressing it firmly this time. The first true phrase escaped into the air, delicate but alive, like a bird breaking free of its cage. The silence deepened, and a strange weight fell over the hall. Connor's laughter no longer came. His lips pressed thin, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time all evening, it was he, not Zoe, who looked trapped. The first phrase hovered in the air like a ghost that refused to vanish. It wasn't flawless, but it carried something raw, something no rehearsal in a conservatory could teach. Zoe's bow trembled, yet the sound cut clear enough to hush the restless feet and clicking phones. The murmurs that had filled every corner just moments ago faded into a silence so sharp it almost hurt. Connor's jaw tightened. His smirk, that mask of untouchable arrogance, cracked under the weight of what he was hearing. He shifted, straightened his tuxedo jacket and glanced around, as if checking whether the others were as unsettled as he suddenly felt. They were. Faces that had been grinning with cruelty now leaned forward, curiosity replacing mockery. Zoe drew another phrase, longer this time, fingers pressing with greater certainty. The melody took shape, delicate yet insistent, rising into the chandelier-lit ceiling. A few guests blinked, confused, caught between wanting to laugh and realizing the joke had already turned. A ripple of awe passed through the front row, subtle at first, then spreading as if the very air had changed. One man lowered his phone, his hand dropping as though ashamed to keep recording. A woman beside him clasped her glass tighter, her smile slipping into something unreadable. And at the center of it all, Zoe's eyes stayed distant, locked not on them, not even on Connor, but somewhere else entirely. She wasn't playing for the ballroom. She was playing for Frank, for the echoes of his violin against damp subway walls, for every lesson he had carved into her heart. Connor's throat worked, a flicker of unease tightening his posture. He forced out a laugh, sharp and hollow. "A parlor trick," he announced, his voice louder than necessary as though he could smother the melody with noise. But the sound of the violin was stronger. It curled around his words, drowned them, replaced them. Zoe shifted her stance, steadier now. Her bow carved out a haunting run of notes, and suddenly the piece felt alive, no longer hesitant. The guests leaned in, caught in the current, as if each vibration plucked at their own hidden memories. Somewhere in the back, a woman whispered, "She's magnificent." Connor's hand curled into a fist at his side. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had staged the moment for humiliation, to remind everyone of their places, him above, her beneath. Yet now he stood in the same silence as the rest, listening to the very girl he had mocked command a hall full of millionaires without a single word. Zoe's chest rose and fell with the rhythm, her expression taut but luminous, as though every note was both pain and release. Her bow danced faster, surer, and the melody built into something undeniable. The chandeliers seemed to glow brighter, their crystals catching the resonance and scattering it across the walls. By the time she struck the final chord of that passage, the silence that followed wasn't mocking, it was reverent. Dozens of guests who had been waiting for her collapse now found themselves stunned, their laughter stolen from their throats. And in that silence, Connor's smirk vanished completely. His eyes darkened, calculating, as though he had realized he was no longer the master of the spectacle. The bow no longer trembled. It glided across the strings with a conviction that startled even Zoe herself. What began as a fragile attempt to survive the humiliation had transformed into something unstoppable, an unleashing of years kept in silence, bottled inside subway tunnels and forgotten nights. The melody swelled. It was no longer hesitant or shy. It rose like a tide, filling every crevice of the ballroom. The guests, who had come dressed to sparkle and be entertained by excess, now sat motionless, spellbound by a maid who should have been invisible. Their jewels glittered in the chandelier light, but none of them shone brighter than the fire in Zoe's eyes. A man in the second row let his phone fall onto his lap, forgotten. A woman pressed her fingertips to her mouth, her mascara threatening to smear. They hadn't expected beauty here, not in this game, not from her. But the violin betrayed them all. It stripped away their arrogance, their indifference, and replaced it with something rare. Silence born of awe. Connor's skin prickled. He felt the weight of dozens of stares shifting, no longer fixed on Zoe as an object of mockery, but on him as the fool who had set this in motion. He tugged at his cufflinks, searching for control, but the music drowned him. He couldn't out-talk it, couldn't out-smile it. The hall belonged to her now. Zoe played faster, her bow dancing in sharp strokes that carried both fury and grace. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm, her entire body alive with the sound. She wasn't performing for their approval. She was pouring out years of hidden longing, grief, and defiance. Every note was Frank's voice echoing in her memory, every phrase a fragment of his teachings reborn. "Feel the music, Zoe," he had once whispered, his wrinkled hand guiding hers. "It's not about perfection, it's about truth." And tonight, truth roared through the gilded room, undeniable. The climax surged, sharp and resonant, vibrating through crystal glasses and polished marble. Some guests leaned forward unconsciously, others held their breath, waiting for release. The melody lifted higher, spiraling until it felt almost unbearable, like the air itself might crack under its intensity. And then, with one final stroke, she landed on a note that hung in the air like a star suspended in darkness. The echo lingered long after her bows stilled. The hall erupted, not in laughter, but in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, clapping, some even whistling. It was not politeness, it was surrender. The maid they had mocked had turned into the center of their evening, their voices, their awe. Phones were still raised, but now they weren't capturing her humiliation, they were capturing her triumph. Clips already rushed into the digital ether, spreading faster than gossip itself. Her face, her music, and most of all Connor's words, "If you play this violin, I'll marry you," were immortalized on 100 screens. Connor didn't clap. His hands stayed rigid at his sides, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Around him the room celebrated her, not him, and for the first time in his empire-built life, he stood on the wrong side of the stage. And then came the voices, sharp, insistent, merciless. "You said you'd marry her." The applause shook the chandeliers, rattling the glasses on silver trays, echoing through the marble like a storm. Yet beneath the celebration rose a different sound, sharper, more dangerous. Voices repeating Connor's own words. "You said you'd marry her. You promised, everyone heard it. It's on video." The crowd turned restless, laughter bubbling again, but not in his favor. This time the mockery was aimed at him. Guests shouted over one another, hungry for a scandal. Phones zoomed in on his face, capturing every twitch, every bead of sweat forming along his temple. Connor raised his hand, forcing a strained smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, it was a joke, a party trick. Surely you don't believe..." But the interruptions came like knives. "We all heard you. No backing out now, Connor. Playful words, sure, but binding when the whole room is watching." The elite, who had once been his allies in cruelty, now smelled blood. Their amusement fed on his discomfort. Zoe lowered the violin slowly, her breathing heavy but steady. She didn't bask in the applause. She simply stood silent, letting the room devour him. Her eyes met his, and though she said nothing, the message was clear. The power he had tried to strip from her now belonged entirely to her hands. Connor tugged at his tie, his voice tight. "This is ridiculous. She's a maid, for God's sake. You expect me to..." The murmurs turned into gasps, and then boos. A man shouted, "Don't insult her now. You made the promise." A woman added, "You can't humiliate someone in front of us all and pretend it never happened." The videos rolled, replaying his smug challenge, "If you play this violin, I'll marry you," followed by Zoe's haunting performance. The evidence spread faster than his excuses. Even those who had wanted only entertainment now demanded justice. Zoe finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying a quiet fire. "You made a promise, Connor. Not to me, but to everyone here." The words were soft, yet they silenced the room more effectively than his booming laugh ever had. Dozens of eyes swung back to him, waiting for an answer. Connor's chest tightened. He had mastered boardrooms, crushed competitors, bought silence with checks larger than most people's dreams. But here now, surrounded by people he thought adored him, he found himself cornered. Every escape route was blocked by screens, by witnesses, by her unshaken presence. He forced a laugh again, brittle and desperate. "Fine," she played. "You were all entertained. Let's move on." But no one moved on. Instead, applause rose again, not for him, but for her. The room belonged to Zoe, and in the corner of his mind, Connor realized that this night would not disappear with champagne and small talk. Tomorrow the headlines would feast on it, and his empire would tremble beneath the weight of a single maid's defiance. Zoe set the violin back into its case with careful hands, her movement steady as though she'd rehearsed this very moment 1,000 times. Then she lifted her chin, meeting his glare with quiet certainty. The celebration turned into a demand. "Marry her! Keep your word! Don't run from what you said!" The chants grew louder, filling the golden hall like a courtroom verdict. Connor's face flushed crimson, his polished confidence cracking. For the first time, he looked less like a king and more like a man exposed. The chants pounded like a drumbeat. "Marry her! Marry her!" It was no longer just teasing. It was a command, a verdict from the very people Connor thought were his loyal admirers. Their eyes sparkled with the thrill of rebellion, delighted to see the mighty cornered. Connor lifted both hands, palms out, his voice cracking beneath forced charm. "Friends, let's be reasonable. It was nothing more than light-hearted banter. Surely you don't expect me to—" "Keep your promise," someone shouted. "Honor your word," another added. Phones raised higher, recording every flinch of his jaw. Zoe stood still, her black uniform contrasting the glitter of diamonds and velvet gowns around her. The violin rested in its case, yet the echo of her music still pulsed in the air. She could have stayed silent and let the mob devour him, but something steadier, sharper, burned in her chest. She stepped forward, her voice clear. "I will never marry a man who treats dignity as a joke." The room froze. Even the chant died as if cut by a knife. All eyes swung back to her, stunned that she dared to speak with such certainty. Connor blinked as if slapped, his mouth opening, but no words forming. Zoe continued, her tone calm but unyielding. "You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone, and now the same crowd demands you pay the price for your arrogance. Not with marriage, not with another joke, but with something real." She let the silence grow heavy, every gaze locked on her. Then, steady as if rehearsed, she declared, $100,000. That's the price of the humiliation you forced on me tonight. Gasps rippled through the room. A murmur rose, like wind sweeping across fields. Some guests laughed in disbelief. Others nodded approvingly, admiring her courage. Phones shook as they captured her words, spreading them even faster than the music had. Connor's face drained of color. "You can't be serious," he hissed, stepping closer, lowering his voice so only the nearest could hear. But whispers carried, and soon everyone caught fragments of his panic. Zoe didn't flinch, her hands clasped before her, steady. "You wanted a spectacle, Connor. Now you have one. Everyone here saw how you treated me. Everyone heard your promise, and everyone is waiting to see if the great millionaire CEO keeps his word, or if he hides behind excuses." The phrase millionaire CEO struck like a spark in the room. Guests smirked, whispered, some even clapped. The mighty title that once shielded him was now a chain dragging him deeper into the humiliation. Connor's breath came heavy, his jaw locked. He looked around searching for allies but saw only eager eyes and recording screens. No one would rescue him. If he refused, the scandal would spread wider. The videos would brand him a coward. Zoe didn't move. She didn't shout. She simply stood, calm, waiting. The girl who once blended into the shadows now commanded a ballroom with nothing but truth. Connor's fingers twitched at his cufflinks. His empire had been built on dominance, but tonight he was cornered by a maid with nothing but courage, and the whole world was already watching. The demand hung in the air like a verdict, $100,000. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't pleaded, it was delivered with the precision of a blade. And in that silence, the ballroom shifted. Zoe had flipped the stage. Connor's laugh came sharp and brittle. 100,000? For what? For 5 minutes of noise on an old violin? His words tried to sting, but they carried no weight. The crowd didn't laugh with him this time. Instead, murmurs swelled, some amused, some angry, all watching him unravel. "Pay her," someone muttered. "She earned it," another said. "Cheaper than the scandal," came a voice from the back, dry and cutting. Phones caught everything. The hashtags were already forming in people's heads. Millionaire CEO mocks Maid, forced to pay. Connor's empire wasn't just built on money, but on image, and tonight that image cracked under the pressure of hundreds of recording eyes. Zoe remained still, her gaze level, her voice calm. "It isn't about the money. It's about the respect you tried to take from me. You wanted to turn me into a joke. That price has a number." Her words landed like a gavel, and even those who had sneered at her minutes earlier now nodded, as though she was speaking for them too. The maid had become the voice of dignity, and the millionaire looked like the jester in his own circus. Connor's jaw clenched. He pulled a crisp handkerchief from his pocket, dabbing his forehead though the room wasn't hot. "Enough of this," he snapped, but his voice cracked. "This game has gone far enough." The crowd roared back, not with applause this time, but with jeers. "Honor it. Don't back down now." "What's 100 grand to you, Connor?" The question cut deep. What was 100 grand to him? A car, a weekend's whim. Yet to Zoe, to the audience watching, it symbolized something far heavier, his accountability. One man near the front, a fellow businessman, smirked and raised his glass. "Connor, pay her. It's the only way to end this." Laughter rippled, mocking laughter, not of amusement but of his downfall. Connor's hands shook slightly as he reached inside his jacket, pulling out a checkbook. The sight itself drew gasps. He never wrote checks. His wealth flowed through wires, accounts, transactions far above the ordinary. Yet here he was, cornered into the most ordinary of acts, paying a debt. Zoe didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply waited, eyes unwavering, as he scribbled the numbers with stiff fingers. The scratching of the pen was louder than the whispers now. When he tore the slip from the book, his hand hesitated. He held it mid-air, his pride battling against the stairs pressing him down. But the weight of the room won. He extended it toward her, his face burning red. Gasps, then scattered applause. Not for him, for her. Zoe took the check slowly, not snatching it, not flaunting it. Her hands were steady, her face calm, as though she'd rehearsed this moment in silence long before it ever arrived. The applause grew, the jeers against Connor louder, and the flash of phones brighter. He had signed away not just money, but his power. And Zoe, clutching the slip of paper, stood taller than she ever had before. Connor's hand dropped the pen as though it had burned him. The applause didn't soothe his pride. It carved deeper into the wound. The hall, once his playground, now felt like a cage. Everywhere he looked, faces gleamed with ridicule, their laughter sharp as glass. The businessman who had urged him to pay raised his champagne and toasted loudly, "To the most expensive violin solo in Manhattan." The room erupted, not with admiration, but with biting laughter. A woman fanned herself with her clutch, smirking. Imagine, a millionaire CEO outsmarted by his own challenge. Connor's ears rang. He wanted to shout, to demand silence, but every time his mouth opened, the chorus of jeers grew louder. He saw the red recording lights of a dozen phones fixed on him, capturing his humiliation frame by frame. He imagined headlines screaming by morning, "CEO pays Maid $100,000 after public dare." Zoe stood a few feet away, the check folded neatly in her hand. She didn't gloat, didn't smile at his collapse. Her calm presence only sharpened his disgrace. Every time his eyes met hers, it felt like looking into a mirror that stripped him of pretense. She wasn't angry. She wasn't desperate. She was dignified. And that, more than anything, crushed him. "Connor!" someone shouted from the back. "She played better than your orchestra." Another voice added, "Marry her anyway!" The room howled with laughter, and though it was said in jest, the words pierced him. His arrogance had boomeranged, and now every joke was at his expense. He reached for a glass of champagne, gulping, his hand shaking so badly the bubbles spilled onto his cuff. The perfect image he had cultivated, sharp suit, confident smile, untouchable aura, lay in ruins at his polished shoes. He could almost feel his empire trembling with it. Investors, partners, rivals, what would they say when they saw this? One of the younger guests, bold with liquid courage, stepped forward and pointed his phone closer. "Smile for us, Connor. This one's going viral." Laughter tore through the hall again, some clapping, some chanting. "Viral, viral, viral!" Connor's throat tightened. For the first time in years, he wanted to run. But his pride chained him to the marble floor. If he fled, he would look weaker still. If he stayed, he would drown in their ridicule. Zoe finally spoke, her voice calm but strong enough to cut through the chaos. "That's enough." The hall stilled, not entirely, but enough for her words to echo. She didn't speak for him, she spoke for herself. "You've all had your fun, but this isn't about a joke anymore, it's about respect. And respect isn't a game." The statement silenced some, embarrassed others. A few lowered their phones, ashamed. Even in victory, she commanded more grace than the man who had tried to destroy her. Connor stared at her, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. She had stripped him of his power without shouting, without cruelty, just truth. And as she turned toward the exit, check in hand, the applause that rose behind her wasn't for his downfall. It was for her walk of dignity through the golden hall that no longer belonged to him. The golden doors of the ballroom opened, and Zoe stepped into the night air. The city hummed beyond the marble steps, horns, footsteps, a restless rhythm that felt far more honest than the false glitter behind her. The cool wind kissed her face, carrying away the suffocating perfume of champagne and arrogance. She held the folded check in her hand, its edges sharp against her palm. $100,000. To Connor, it was a bruise to his pride. To her, it was the price of her dignity, though not its measure. She didn't need the paper to know her worth. She had already claimed it in the silence of that hall when her bow sang louder than their laughter. Zoe paused at the edge of the steps, closing her eyes. She could almost hear it again, the rasp of Frank's voice, the scratch of his bow in the subway tunnels. He had played not for fame or fortune, but because music was life itself. In the rhythm of trains rattling and coins clinking into an open case, he had taught her that truth doesn't need permission. "Did you hear me tonight, Grandpa?" she whispered into the night, her voice trembling just once. "I finally played, and they listened." For a moment, the city answered with the distant call of a saxophone player on a street corner, a melody floating through the night air. It was imperfect, raw, but alive. She smiled, wiping a tear before it could fall. Behind her, the ballroom roared with lingering chaos, Connor drowning in whispers, his name already traveling faster than he could contain. Tomorrow, headlines would feast on him. But tonight, Zoe had walked out free, unbroken, and heard. She unfolded the check under a street lamp. The ink gleamed, Connor's signature stiff and angry across the bottom. $100,000. She thought of bills unpaid, of dreams delayed, of doors closed because of uniforms and labels. She thought of the tiny apartment she shared with silence too heavy for her violin to fill. And for the first time, possibility felt real. But she also knew this paper wasn't victory. It was just evidence. The real triumph was walking into that hall invisible and walking out untouchable. A passerby glanced at her, curious, but Zoe tucked the check into her pocket and lifted her chin. The night was hers. Not the millionaires, not their games, not their shallow approval. Hers. As she walked down the steps and merged into the current of the city, her pace was steady, her shoulders squared. She no longer felt like a maid who had been mocked, but like a woman who had faced an empire of arrogance and left standing taller. And far above, in the glittering ballroom she'd left behind, Connor still stood surrounded, stripped of his invincibility, haunted not by the price he paid, but by the truth he could never silence. A maid with a violin had bested him in front of them all. That night in New York, beneath chandeliers that once laughed at her silence, Zoe left not with shame, but with dignity. The check in her pocket was proof of what she had endured, yet her true victory was invisible. The courage to stand, to play, to demand respect in a world that never expected her voice to matter. Connor returned to his empire smaller than he had ever been, trapped not by the loss of money, but by the memory of a maid who had silenced him without cruelty, without power, only with truth. And the truth had spread far beyond those golden walls. For Zoe, the memory of Frank lived on in every note. His lessons in subway tunnels became her shield in the grandest hall, and though she walked back into the night alone, she carried more than money. She carried the hope that no matter how invisible life tries to make you, dignity can shine brighter than chandeliers, because respect, once claimed, can never again be taken away. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.